Alright, so hello everyone. Today I'm going to be going over the involvement of prescription opioids in the opioid crisis. And so a little bit of background information. Uh, Prior to the latter part of the 20th century, there was little to no use really in with opioids in medicine. They were only really used for malignant pain, for cancers, and this was really due to the prevalent opioid abuse in the earlier parts of the century. And this all changed in the 80s and 90s when there were cries for better chronic pain management, and a lot of these cries were done by major health organizations, actually, such as the World Health Organization, the American Pain Society, and the Veterans Health Administration, just to name a few. And on top of the pressure from these organizations, there was also intense marketing by pharmaceutical companies to increase the use of opioids. And along with this came the release of new quote unquote abuse resistant controlled release opiates. And these were supposed to nullify the usual methods of abuse by making it take much longer to get the full dose of the opiate. And one of the main culprits in today's opioid crisis is OxyContin, which actually released in 1985 or 1995 and was the new controlled release opiate. And this was a variant of oxycodone, and it grew in popularity so quickly that in 1997 only 670,000 prescriptions existed, and by 2002 there were already 6.2 million prescriptions in existence. And this trend continued throughout the 2000s, leading up until the current day crisis, which the US government recently declared as a public health emergency in October of 2017. And some statistics on opioid abuse. In 2017, prescription opioids were responsible for over 35% of opioid overdose deaths in the US, which is quite alarming. And nearly 218,000 overdose deaths occurred in the US between 1999 and 2017 due solely to prescription opioid use. And each year this got worse and worse. Heroin caused upwards of 15,000 overdose deaths in 2017 alone. And the key correlation with this is that around 3 out of 4 heroin users that began between 2000 and 2013 reported abusing prescription opioids prior to heroin. So there is an enormous connection between prescription opioid use and current day opioid use in general. And that can be seen as well on the graphic to the right as the deaths involving opioids have climbed and climbed ever since the release of these new drugs. And so this is the chemical structure of a few opioids: oxycodone, morphine, and heroin. And you can tell obviously that these structures are very similar in nature, as they are all opioids. However, heroin is much more similar to morphine than it is to oxycodone, as heroin is in fact a derivative of morphine, while oxycodone is a derivative of theanine. However, they are all derivatives of the opium plant. And as for the mechanism of action of OxyContin, it's very similar to many other opioids in that it essentially has the same mechanism of action as oxycodone, and it's a full opioid receptor agonist, binding the mu, delta, and kappa receptors within the central nervous system. And it's analgesic, or this analgesic has primary action on the mu opioid receptor. And this is a G protein coupled receptor. and the activation of which um, inhibits the activation of the effector protein adenylate cyclase, which in turn lowers the intracellular concentration of C-amp, which is activated by adenylate cyclase. And now this inhibition blocks the release of such neurotransmitters as norepinephrine, acetylcholine, dopamine, GABA, and substance P. And the mechanism for the specific euphoric feeling that is key in this drug's and other drugs abuse is specifically due to the GABA inhibition that occurs in the nucleus accumbens. Now, this lack of GABA actually causes release of dopamine from surrounding neurons, which gives the euphoric effect. Obviously, the release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens is very important in reinforcement, and I'll talk about that again later. Right now. So the addiction pathway of opiate abuse. So this is the main component in opiate dependence, and for this pathway, you have dopamine going from the ventral tegmental area, which is housed in the midbrain, all the way to the ventral striatum of the basal ganglia. And the ventral striatum is key because it houses the nucleus accumbens, which the dopamine interactions that occur in the nucleus accumbens are very important in regulating reinforcement through desire for rewards. And this path is heavily stimulated during opiate use. And so for popular methods of OxyContin abuse, this includes the crushing, primarily the crushing of the pill, which can then be consumed through the nose where it crosses the mucous membrane into the bloodstream, or it could also be dissolved into a liquid so as to be taken intravenously. Another method for abuse, however, is to take the drug orally, which you simply consume much higher than the recommended dosage. And so for the FDA regulation of OxyContin, it began with FDA approval in 1995 under the assumption that the time release mechanism would deter all abusive behavior. And obviously this was quickly found to be not the case, because as early as 2000, the FDA was already aware of heavy abuse of the drug and began to change the way that it handled the situation. It changed the labels to provide better warnings and instructions for both patients and physicians so as to avoid abuse, and also included a patient package insert, which essentially informed patients of the dangers of the drug and dangers of abuse and also of overdose. Also in 2003, the FDA issued a warning to manufacturer Purdue Pharma about their aggressive marketing tactics, which this warning was not very effective, as I'll talk about later. And in 2010, the FDA finally approved a new formula for the drug, designing it to be much more difficult to abuse by making it much more difficult to be crushed and dissolved. However, another popular method of taking it orally in large amounts was still viable and an issue to this day. The symptoms of OxyContin withdrawal, which are very heavily involved in the reason why the drug is so difficult to quit. The withdrawal period is relatively long for OxyContin, as it lasts 1 to 2 weeks, if not more, and the symptoms can actually be separated into an earlier category and a later category. So in the first 3 days or so, the patient will be experiencing anxiety, agitation, as well as insomnia, muscle aches, and flu symptoms. However, later on in the withdrawal period, they will experience more nausea and vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, dilated pupils, and a rapid heartbeat. Some of the symptoms of OxyContin overdose and why it's such a dangerous drug is because it depresses the central nervous system. And so, with an overdose, you'll see slowed and shallow breathing, unresponsiveness and loss of consciousness, cyanosis, small pupils, and eventually respiratory failure. And pictured on the screen is Narcan nasal spray, a very popular method of reversing overdose for opioids. And treatment for OxyContin abuse disorder. So, similar to many other opioids, the process of detoxification for OxyContin can be quite painful and uncomfortable. And so, in order to help with this, many patients will go to an inpatient rehabilitation program where they can go to detox, and they will actually normally have medication assisted treatment, which will allow them to wean off of the opioids in their system by using partial agonists such as Suboxone. Some will continue this treatment as an outpatient program, which can involve counseling and also monthly intravenous injections of naltrexone, another partial opioid agonist. And this can curb the cravings and make a patient less likely to relapse. And so for Purdue Pharma, they were actually in 2007 handed federal charges for which they were forced to hand over $634.5 million, which really is only a fraction of their total profit. And the company also settled for $19.5 million in a lawsuit with over 20 different states over their predatory practices. It isn't much, but it's a start. And these are my references, so thank you for listening.